What's up, gang? I thought I'd try a little bit of a different video today, and we're going to be looking at the meta in Season 1. Not strictly the meta, we're going to be looking at basically what classes people are playing for the most part, probably for good reasons as well, right? So we're going to break down like why people are going to be playing these classes. This video might also help you decide on what you want to play or what classes you should invite to your keys. Remember, all classes can clear the majority of keys, right? But like sometimes you do want those meta specs in your keys to make life a little bit easier. So I think what I'm going to do is we're going to look at keys between level 10 and 11, because I think this is where the meta starts to like come into the action, right? And then we're also going to compare these numbers with the level 12 and up keys when the Xal'atath's Guile Affix comes into play. So we're going to look at each of the roles individually in the 10 to 11 range and then also the 12 and up range, because that's where the keys really start to get hard, right? And we'll just talk about why these specs are being played so much, okay? So we'll start off with the tanks then. And as you can see straight away, there is quite a stark difference. This has actually changed since I last looked at it. So we've got Prot Warriors are kind of dominating right now, right? They're at 28.2% of the overall population, and for good reason. They are by far the sturdiest tank right now, I would say. They are also putting out some incredible damage. There are definitely specs that other tank specs that do more damage, but the Prot Warrior, with its sturdiness and also how much damage it's doing, Relentless, who I play with quite a bit, is always pumping out like 1.3 mil overalls. It's ridiculous. Basically feels like we got a third DPS at some points. But I think people, for the most part, are playing the Prot Warrior just because of how comfy you feel. Like, you are always so tanky on the spec. You've got so many different defensive cooldowns. And you also bring some utility as well. You've got your AoE Shockwave, which is super nice for stops. You've got your Rallying Cry, which, like, to be honest, I think abilities like Rallying Cry and Mass Barrier, we'll get onto that later. I think they're super, super helpful for this season because there is just so much AoE damage going out that cannot be stopped. So these abilities are just great counters to that. Battle Shout is not so much of a reason to bring a Prot Warrior this season. Like, you don't really have that many great melee specs. There's a few in there, but I wouldn't say it's meta defining, and that's why we're bringing the Prot Warrior, right? We're bringing it for all of the reasons that I've just mentioned. So next up, we have the Blood Death Knight. Now, I feel like at the key level 10 to 11, and we will see this when we change to 12 and up, Blood DK is probably what most people consider the most fun tank, and I imagine that that is still spilling over into these 10 and 11 keys because the Blood DK is susceptible to just falling over, and in these keys you can still I mean in higher keys as well you can get away with playing it for sure. If you're a good Blood DK, then just main Blood DK and play it, all right? Blood's got some really nice utility for the group as well. Like, I would argue that Blood is maybe one of the best pugging tanks. You've got so many stops with your death grips. Gorfrien's Grasp, if you do play that, I don't know if you even are playing that right now. You've got Blinding Sleet, you've got your like mid-range kick as well. You've got AMZ for your group 2, and AMS even now applies to 2 other allies if you're talented into Vestigial Shell. So those are the reasons why the Blood DK is still played this much. It's in second place at this level of key. And then we move on to the Guardian Druid, which is kind of close to the VDH, but Guardian Druid, you'll see, is going to take over in the 12 and up range. It's not too far behind the Blood DK as it is, but it's an easier tank to play. Like, Guardian is quite often represented as one of the easiest tank spec to play. I mean, almost definitely. It does insane damage inside its cooldowns. I mean, nothing's really changed for Bear in that regard, right? Like, when you're in your Incarn, you pull big, you're immortal, and you do turbo dam. It also brings Mark of the Wild, which I think would be the tipping point. If it wasn't behind the Prot Warrior in terms of tankiness, then I think Guardian Druid might be the meta tank for this season because of that Mark of the Wild. Like, a 3% first buff to your team is just massive, especially in those higher keys. You bring amazing utility as well. You've got multiple stops. You've got your in-cap roar. You got your Typhoon and Vortex if you're talented into those. You've got off heals with your Dream of Cenarius, which are actually potent off heals as well. So you do get a lot out of bringing the Guardian Druid to your group, and that is why when you go to 12 and up, it quite quickly overtakes the Blood DK, and you see these other tanks fall down. Prot and Brewmaster are always going to be lower. I mean, nobody plays Brewmaster anyway, right? And Prot's just not in a great position. I do think that the Prot is going to start being played more because of the recent buffs to it, but it still is a bit of a glass cannon, I think. It does a lot of damage. But as you can see, in the 12 and up range, we have a 41% representation from the Prot Warrior, and that is because of what we mentioned earlier. It's just so, it is the tankiest tank right now. It's putting out some great damage, and it's got some niche utility that is useful. One thing I will say with a prop paladin is I imagine if this gets tankiness buffs, then this could very quickly become a meta tank because of the interrupt changes. So if you stop certain mobs on their certain abilities, they will just instantly recast their abilities now. That actually used to like sort of act as a kick. So that just by default is going to make the prop paladin with all of its kicks from its Avenger's shield just infinitely more valuable. But saying that, obviously, as it stands right now, as we look at it, it is not in a great spot right now. So let's go back to the level 10 to 11 key bracket then, and let's check out the healers, which is interesting, but it's only going to get more interesting when I go to the 12s and ups, right? So we have over 50% representation from the restoration chamois right now, and I don't think it's to anybody's surprise. Over 50% of the player base is a resto chamois like that. Well, in this key range, right? That is mental. Like, that is actually so wild. But I think, honestly, the main reason, because the resto chamois don't even necessarily have the most healing throughput, but I think their utility is what sets them apart. And the biggest part of utility that they are bringing to the group right now is you pretty much have a 10% perma increase on your health, which is super, super valuable in higher keys. But that can be a 20% increase when you get your downpours as well. So 20% extra health, like, that is literally the difference between using a defensive and not using a defensive, or even just living and not living with it or without a defensive. So that is just like, that is invaluable utility that they're bringing to the group right there. They also, speaking of utility, they also have the shortest kick in the game on a 12-second cooldown. They have a poison cleansing totem, which is just turbo broken this season. Like, half of the dungeons make this poison cleansing totem so good for the group. They also bring a curse dispel for your stone vaults. I think there's another dungeon as well where curse dispels are proven very valuable. They've got an AoE stop with capacitor totem. They have their thunder shot. I don't know if they talent into it, but they have their thunder shot, which knocks up as well. So that is another AoE stop. And then they also just recently got an insane raid buff as well. They bring a mastery buff to the whole group, and they also buff melee attacks, which is super nice because of frost decays, but we'll get onto those later as well. So yeah, now you can probably see why the resto chamois is the most played spec by an absolute landslide. And apart from this spec in particular, we have a pretty relatively even spread of the rest of the healers. I can tell from personal experience, I've definitely seen a lot more holy pallies outside of just playing with resto chamois, basically. So let's move on to the keys 12 and up. This has got even worse than when I last saw it. It was 70% last time I saw it, but it's now 80%. And that, again, just in these higher keys, the 20% extra health that you can get and the 10% permanent extra health that you pretty much have is just second to none. Like, you cannot beat that. You do see some more discipline priests here. Discipline is quite strong right now, and it also brings PI to the group, which is going to be amazing for certain specs. And then also they do bring a stamina buff as well. So yeah, I mean, you're seeing a little correlation here with this extra stamina for your group being very, very nice to have. So now let's move on to the DPS, and there are some clear outliers here, right? We'll start with the Ret Paladin, because I don't necessarily, like, Ret's not a meta spec by any means, but the thing is with Ret is it's a very easy spec to play, so a lot of people get drawn to it because of that. It's fun, it's flashy, blah, 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 and it is very strong at the moment as well. It's not as strong as some of the other specs that we'll talk about later, but it's doing a lot of AoE DPS. Even its single target isn't too bad in Mythic Plus. It feels like the bridge has been slightly gapped there. It's still a problem where Ret is like all AoE or all single target. And it's also very, very tanky. So it's a very forgiving spec to play as well. So I think that's why people just gravitate towards this spec so much. And if we quickly take a look at the level 12 and up range, you'll see that it drops quite dramatically, okay? But we'll go back to the 10 and 11. We'll stick here for now. To nobody's surprise here, the second most played spec is the Frost Death Knight right now. It's crazy how, like, nobody ever plays Frost DK normally. It's normally, like, one of these specs down here. But because of how strong this spec is, we're seeing over 10% of the population playing Frost DK right now. This spec has the highest damage in the game. I don't think anything comes close to it in terms of just raw DPS output. It's got, like, yeah, I mean, that is more so for AoE, but even its single target and priority damage is nuts as well. Death Knights in general are pretty much unkillable. They are ridiculously tanky. They have a plethora of defensive cooldowns, and then if they find themselves in a bit of a pickle, they can just Death Strike the healing back up and they're good. And they also bring decent utility. It's like, the thing with DKs has always been niche utility. It's not necessarily something that's desired, but it is nice to have if they are a meta spec, which they definitely are right now. You've got your mid-range kicks, so you don't necessarily have to be on the mob to kick them. You've got Blinding Sleet as an AoE stop. You can talent into your Asphyxiate stun as well. You've got 2 charges of Death Grip, so you can pull mobs, those stubborn casters that you need to get into the pack to cleave them down. Great for that as well. And they even bring some tankiness for the group in terms of utility as well. Like I mentioned with the Blood DK earlier, they've got their Vestigial Shell, which applies a lesser AMS to 2 party members, and they also have anti-magic zone. And like these things, just they do add up over the course of a key, and they become even more important in these higher keys as well. As you can see in the level 12 and up range as well, they shoot up to a 20% of the DPS player base, which is just ridiculous. If you want to be timing the highest keys right now, you need a Frost DK. Just the amount of damage alone that they put out is absurd and reason enough that you need one in your keys. Then we have the Arcane Mage, and like I don't know whether to look at just Mage as a whole, because I feel like a lot of mages will like dip and dab between all of the specs, or even just for now Frost and Arcane, because the thing with Arcane is it's all about priority damage and single target or boss damage, and that's where it excels at, with some great passive cleave as well. But then on the flip side, you can play Frost Mage in the same class and do more overall damage, because Frost is great at AoE, it's great at cleave, and it's also great at single target. It covers all bases. Fire has the most AoE damage out of the mage specs right now, but that's it. It doesn't compete with them in any other form of fight, so you're better off just picking one of the other 2 for now, at least anyway. But I mean, yeah, it doesn't really surprise me that there is a mage spec that is classed as like a more meta spec. I don't know if mage is like... Mage probably is outright meta as we speak, but I do think it is in a position where it could be replaced, because they're like, it was the same with Dragonflight Season 1. I feel like class balance as a whole right now, well, at least for DPS, let's say, is in a good spot. There are a lot of specs that are like doing a lot of damage right now, and they can all compete with each other. So then it becomes a case of like utility, and that's where the mage kind of gains its feet back, right? You've got your Mass Barrier, like I mentioned with the Prot Warriors Rallying Cry earlier. I feel like Mass Barrier, even though it got nerfed, its value is ridiculous this season because there is just so much unavoidable AoE damage. You've got 2 AoE stops in Blast Wave and also Dragon's Breath or Supernova, depending on which one you talent into. You've got 20-second kick, which is shorter than a normal range kick, but also you have your shifting power, which means you can get even more kicks in. And then obviously I have to mention the Arcane Intellect as well. Again, did get a nerf, but that kind of intellect for the rest of your group, especially when you're probably going to be playing with an Org and higher keys, and also even just for your healer, the increased throughput for your whole group, especially if you've got a more caster-based comp, is just nuts. And then Mage is probably one of the tankiest specs in the game. You do have to be proactive with it, and I think that's where a lot of people do struggle, because the Mage defensive toolkit is kind of hard to execute well. But if you are a good Mage player, then yeah, Mage is definitely one of the more tanky specs in the game. You've got Mirror Images, Alter Time, Barrier, Mass Barrier, Invis, Ice Block, 2 Ice Blocks with Frost Mage. It's honestly just insane at this point. And then going into the key levels 12 and up, the amount of play stays consistent just because Mage is just such a reliable pick for those higher keys. It always has been, and it probably always will be. Then we'll move on to the Augmentation Evoker, which comparably sees a lot more play in the plus 12 and up keys. By default, right, the reason you bring an Aug to the higher keys is for survivability. If you need survivability to time a key, then Aug is going to be meta. If it's not, then you're likely going to bring another DPS class. That being said, Aug's DPS this season, because of the hero talents, is mental. Aug's actually, especially if you look at logs, like a lot of people will be judging based off of details, but if you look at logs, Aug is doing insane amounts of damage, but it is also bringing utility that you just cannot get from elsewhere. Like the amount of AoE stops that this spec has is nuts, which is super nice for this season because you don't have, if you're doing big pulls, you don't have the amount of kicks that you do need to constantly keep these mobs kicked on cooldown. So instead, you just have to literally AoE stop over and over and over again, and having an Aug inside of that, because there's going to be overlaps, especially if you're not in comms. Having an Aug to take care of a lot of that just makes you feel so much safer and makes the key so much smoother. Then to touch on the survivability that I was talking about just before, this spec just does make your group infinitely more tanky, doesn't it? Like, the tank just becomes so much more tanky. The healer's got more throughput because of the Ebb and Mites. That makes your group more tanky in turn. You get Verse from the Orc's Mastery. You've got a Zephyr from them. You've got a Rescue from them to baby like a squishier DPS. And also like even just the Temporal Shield that you get from the Breath of Eons. Org is in a very, very good spot now. And I feel like people don't really appreciate how good Org is right now. So I imagine that once the meta is fully settled in these higher keys, you're going to be seeing Orgs. You're going to be seeing Frost DKs for sure. I think the third spot is up for contention, but I would imagine it is between Mage or Asa Rogue. So Asa Rogue is the final DPS that I'm going to talk about. Again, like the Arcane Mage, Asa just deletes priority mobs, and there are a lot of scary priority mobs this season. But while doing that, they also do incredible AoE DPS. I don't know if Caustic Spatter got a buff, but Caustic Spatter is pumping right now. Crimson Tempest is pumping right now. So they have all of the bases covered when it comes to any form of DPS that they need to do. Their utility as a rogue is crazy too, but specifically Asa, especially this season, I'm going to mention the kicks again, but being able to open and even not open, like when they're vanishing, whenever they come out of stealth and they garrote, they're silencing like, what, 6 to 8 mobs? That is like, you cannot fathom how much that makes your key so much easier. So Asa has gained even more value in that sense for its utility purposes. Then you've got Cheap Shot, you've got your Kidney Shot, you've got your AoE blind as well, because rogues now also have an AoE stop. You've got Shroud, which actually does have some use cases this season. You see it a lot in like Mist, let's say, but other dungeons too. And the more that we play this season, the more we'll be able to do more and more skips, which the Asa Rogue makes doable. And then being a rogue, they are also super tanky as well. I don't specifically know what the hero talents do for the Asa Rogue, but I imagine they do make them tankier in some way. And just by default, they have their evasion, they have their Cloak of Shadows, they have 2 charges of Feint. So although not as tanky as some of the other specs that we've mentioned here, they are definitely still a tanky choice. I think the balance for this season is generally good when it comes to DPS. Like, I actually don't know what's going to end up being played the most out of Rogue or Mage. I think they're the two that are fighting for the spot. Or maybe even you could substitute Org out if we don't need it. And I'm not going to go too much into Balance Druid, but I mean, you're even seeing Balance Druids, like up the top here. Like, Balance is doing a ridiculous amount of overall damage. I don't think it competes with the Frost DK. It might do in some dungeons, I'm not sure. I haven't seen enough of Balance yet, but I have heard some rumors about how good Balance is. And Balance does bring some great utility as well with all of the different AoE stops. Solar Beam actually gained a lot of value as well because of the interrupt changes. And then obviously they do also bring Mark of the Wild. So yeah, that is kind of what the meta is shaping up to look like at the moment. I just wanted to jump on and quickly talk about it. Like, I don't really know too much what I want to do with the YouTube at the moment, so I'm just sort of experimenting with these types of videos. And maybe, who knows, we could make this into a little series where, like, anytime there's changes, we could take a look at if that's impacted the amount of play that we're seeing from the different specs. So if you guys do want to see more of this, then leave a like down below. Drop a comment on what you're maining. Subscribe to your boy if you haven't already. And until next time, I'll catch you guys later.